Hello and welcome to the Apologetics 315 podcast with your hosts Brian Auten and Chad Gross. Join us for conversations and interviews on the topics of apologetics, evangelism, and the Christian worldview.
Frankly, there have been a lot of wild stories in the media, and we want to assess any possible environmental impact from your operation.
Hello and welcome to the podcast. This is Brian Auten.
And I'm Chad Gross.
And we're looking forward to today's interview with Christian philosopher Paul Gould. Well, Chad, back in episode 041, we talked to Paul Gould about cultural apologetics, but today we're talking to him about his new book. What did you think of the book?
I really enjoyed it, and I like the layout, which I'm going to allow Paul to talk about that more, so I'm not going to kind of steal his thunder, but I thought the layout was unique, and I love how he brought out some topics that you often don't see in apologetics books. And I also think that a lot of these topics, some of the ones I'm thinking of are how to deal with meaning, love, beauty, are things that are kind of blind spots in my own apologetic, if you will. One of the things I want to try to get from this interview is how could I maybe integrate some of this thinking into my own apologetic, because I tend to be very argument oriented in the sense of like I like philosophical arguments and premises, and those that does move me in my thinking and excite me. But the more I talk to people, the more I realize that I'm kind of in the minority there, and using beautiful stories and art and things like that, I think can really move arguments in a direction that they can't move all by themselves. And so I'm hoping to gain some knowledge in that area from this interview.
Yeah, definitely. The book itself is called A Good and True Story, 11 Clues to Understanding Our Universe and Your Place in It. And basically, if I had to give a quick, rough summary of it, it's arguing that Christianity is the true story of the world. He covers 11 clues about the world, kind of a 360-degree exploration of the landscape of our experience. It gives a cumulative case for Christianity, sort of delivered in a story and journey, looking at what we can learn when we look deeply at the big questions of life, like the universe, morality, meaning, happiness, pain, love, beauty, all the aspects of the world that provide signposts for our place in it and the story we find ourselves in. If he asked me to write the back in 5 minutes, I would do that.
I thought that was pretty good.
Why, thank you. Well, yeah, I enjoyed it. There's some familiar material, and then there's stuff that you don't get in every apologetics book, and I hope maybe we can unpack some of that today. But in case you haven't heard of Paul Gould, he is the Associate Professor of Philosophy of Religion and the Director of the MA in Philosophy of Religion at Palm Beach Atlantic University. He's also the founder and the president of the Two Tasks Institute, a past 2019-2020 visiting fellow at the Henry Center for Theological Understanding at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. And he has a master's in philosophy of religion and ethics from Talbot School of Theology and a PhD in philosophy from Purdue University. So you can find out more information and resources from Paul Gould at his website, paul-gould.com. So I'm looking forward to this interview, and we'll see you on the other side.
Let's get ready. Switch me on.
Right, Paul Gould, thanks for coming back to the podcast.
Thanks, guys. It's great to be with both you, Brian, and you, Chad. Looking forward to our conversation.
Yes.
Yeah, well, tell us a little bit about Palm Beach Atlantic University. I think people know other universities that have to do with apologetics, but they might not be as familiar with Palm Beach Atlantic. I think Paul Copan's there, isn't he?
That's right. Yeah. Paul Copan's here and Brandon Rickabaugh is here. So we've got three philosophers, and we've got some visiting scholars that also teach for our program, Ryan Mullins and another one that I'll be able to announce shortly. But yeah, we're doing an MA in philosophy here at Palm Beach Atlantic University, having a lot of fun. Many of us are super indebted to Talbot. I went to Talbot. Dr. Rickabaugh went to Talbot. In many ways, we're following in their footsteps, and we just think that God's doing something special here in South Florida and perhaps the East Coast with philosophy. And Palm Beach Atlantic is actually super strategic in so many ways. Right now, we're in the midst of kind of a move of a lot of Wall Street is moving down to West Palm Beach. And so you have all this wealth that's transferring, and all these pretty important businesses that are currently on the stock on Wall Street are coming down here. And so it's becoming a very strategic zip code in terms of the wealth of the world, all concentrated here, and a lot of tech. So we've got that going on. And then we've also got, we're kind of like at the door of South America and Europe. It's an easy, flight from the UK or from anywhere in Europe here, or even North Africa or South Africa. And so it's kind of strategically located in that way. And so we're 2 years in to the MA program, and we're actually getting ready to graduate our first graduates. But we're just super excited for what God is doing and the community of philosophers and apologists that God is bringing to us and building. So yeah, we're pretty excited and having a good time.
Cool. Thanks for that. We'll link to those in the show notes if people are interested in master's programs and the like, and they want maybe some palm trees instead of snow. That might be a good pick for them. So, last time we talked about cultural apologetics, and today we're kind of following that theme a little bit, talking about your newest book, A Good and True Story.
Paul, your book has a kind of a unique format, which I really enjoyed. Can you talk a bit about the format for our listeners and kind of why you chose to organize it the way you did?
Yeah, good. I'm glad you picked it out. It is unique in many ways. So this is a book. It's a follow-up to my book, Cultural Apologetics, which was written for Christians about this thing called cultural apologetics. And in that book, one of the sort of prescriptive things that I left the reader with was, hey, we can join with God and with each other and the Holy Spirit to re-enchant the world. And I gave sort of two ways that we can do that. One is that we can learn as Christians to see and delight in the world the way Jesus does. And then secondly, that we could learn to invite others to see and delight in the world the way Jesus does. And those two ideas are two future book projects, of which this book that we're talking about today is related to that second idea of helping others to see and delight in the world the way Jesus does. And so this is written for non-believers. It's not a book about cultural apologetics, but rather it's a book, I would consider it a work of cultural apologetics, where I'm trying to demonstrate or utilize the kinds of ideas, that I was unpacking in that earlier work. But there are, and I'm glad you noticed this. There are a couple sort of underlying assumptions that are in the background, and I'll just make them explicit here. And one is a thesis about reality. One is a thesis about what it means to be human, and then one is a thesis about evidence. And these kind of shape the way that I went about writing the book. And so the thesis about reality is pretty simple. It's the idea that reality is best understood as a kind of story, right? There's a beginning, there's a middle, and there's an end to it, just like a story. And it's, as it turns out, I think it's the divine drama, right? And the Christian tradition has thought of reality for quite some time in terms of, all things are from God, and one day all things return to God, this Exodus, Redidus kind of narrative story arc. And so that's a thesis about reality itself that informs the structure of the book. The second is a thesis about humans ourselves, and that's the idea that many philosophers, literary critics, historians, theologians have noted is that humans are narratival animals, that we're storied creatures. Lewis would call it that we're poetical animals. And the idea is that we're creatures that, enter into this world, and we immediately begin to find our meaning and our purpose and our identity by finding a story in which to narrate our lives. And so that's a thesis about kind of how we're wired. And so that's why I wrote the book as a kind of quest, right, to discover that true story of the world. And then lastly, the third thesis is a thesis about evidence. It's one that I brought up in the earlier book, but I'm now playing with it in this one. It's a thesis unpacked by Stephen Evans in his book, Theistic Natural Signs and the Knowledge of God, which is a wonderful book where he basically says that the evidence for God is widely available, but it's easily resistible. And what he means by that is that, the evidence is everywhere, but it needs to be interpreted. And so part of what I want to do here is help by taking 11 features of the world that I think are particularly clear signs and serve as a guide, right? And just help people to see these signs for, I think, the evidential impact that they have. So anyway, that's kind of the assumptions that were kind of driving the way that I structure the book as a kind of quest to discover the true story of the world.
As you're talking there, Paul, and you're talking about story, one thing comes to mind, and that's, it seems like any book I'm listening to, it could be a business book, it could be a science book or anything, or it could be a diet book. You always hear something like, well, when in our Paleolithic past, when we were hunter-gatherers on the, or we were living in caves, and there's always this sort of story that the culture just kind of adopts. Now, whether or not that's accurate to whatever degree is not the point, but it's like everything's laid into a story as sort of the foundation of how we understand, oh, what we're doing today is because of our evolutionary past, or what we're doing today is because of the progression of this story. So what do you think it is? You mentioned there some of the aspects of stories that this is like built in. What is it about story that's important when we're doing apologetics and maybe could be missing from a lot of apologetics?
Yeah, no, that's really good. I think, I've started to, even when I do standard apologetics, I've noticed that I've kind of shifted. I still do a lot, those of us who are, I'm formally trained in philosophy, but, I'll often be asked to talk about, like, does God exist? Or, why did God allow evil and things like this? And there's kind of a standard like way that you can kind of walk your way through some of these issues. You can look at classic arguments for God, and same with the problem of evil. There's classic responses to the problem of evil and things like that. And I still do think that those things are super important. But I've also begun to drill down to what's usually the question beneath the question, or the intuition that drives the question. And I think the question beneath the question is there a story that understands me, right? I think this is one of the fundamental stories that drives the human person, right? And I think, and part of this is I think we have this intuition at the level of our guts that reality is coherent, right? That there is some narrative that will sort of tie this together and help us to make sense of that. And so I think that I just want to bring that out. So often in maybe contemporary apologetics, we'll do kind of apologetics without context. And sometimes the context helps us interpret that well, right? That's the whole idea of the two theses, that context helps us see the evidence in a different light. And so one of the things that's led me to do, apart from asking this question, is there a story that understands you, of all the competing stories, right? There's so many: consumerism, hedonism, are practical ones. There could be naturalism or atheism or postmodernism, or ones that are often thrown out by apologists. But whatever it is, does that story actually understand you?
There's sort of a push and a pull in my mind when I think about that approach. On one hand, there's the aspect of you can appeal to, themes that are uncommon with everyone. But at the same time, maybe the Christian story to many people could be miles and miles away from the way they see the world. So there's a big gap. Any ways to bridge that gap if someone's really got a diametrically opposed worldview? Are there easy bridges that way?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. You're right. Especially in our culture, as we become more and more, I don't know, sometimes people use post-Christian or even anti-Christian or sub-Christian. As we become more and more a culture sort of unmoored from the traditional Judeo-Christian way of viewing the world, I think you're right. There is a sense in which either people don't understand the basic Christian story, or if they do, they don't like it. They don't want it to be the case. And so this is where I think we need to do all the stuff that we typically do, right? Any cultural apologetic worth its salt has to engage the arguments, right? We have to show the truth of Christianity. I think what I've been arguing for years as I've been thinking about this is that we have to do more than that, especially in a post-Christian world, right? We have to show the desirability. So that involves living a certain kind of life, right? That involves being a certain kind of person, right? That we would live a life that's responsive to reasons as Christians, and that we would live a life, following the way, which is, again, a appeal to the story. The Christian life is a kind of story. So there's that. I just want to make sure we're careful. Like, it doesn't mean that we don't give the arguments. I think we give the arguments, but we press to give them context through these stories, right? Yeah. And that's kind of what I've done so I'm not in some ways, I'm not doing anything new. I'm just trying to take what we've been doing so well, defending the rationality of our faith, and help people see that it's not just true, but it's satisfying. It's actually the thing that we've been longing for all of our lives. And so that takes a little more time, a little more creativity. As Lewis did so well, it requires us to engage the imagination, and not just reason, but both in dialogue.
I want to say just real quick as a point about the book is that was something, what you said there, that resonated with me, because that's what your book challenged me to do. And also our prior interview with you is that I think the way I think is geared toward, well, is it true or not? And that's kind of what I want to know. I love how you said there, but is it satisfying? And I think that's a blind spot in my own personal apologetic, if you will, of I think I leave that out a lot of times when I'm talking to people about Christianity. And so I'm hoping to get a more to develop a more kind of fully orbed apologetic, if you will. So I appreciate that.
One thing about story that seems obvious is it seems just to pull people in and it disarms them. So there's that aspect that's useful, I think, when we're trying to be persuasive about the Christian faith, but also appealing to common experience, that we always try to explain the world we're in. And like everyone, they try to tell ourselves stories about why things are happening, why did this happen, and try to fit it within a story. I wonder if we could kind of look at that. One of the aspects of your 11 clues that you outline in the book, one of them is meaning. To me, the aspect of fitting into a story, you can't have meaning in your life if you don't have a story to fit into, it seems. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that role of meaning, of explaining our world.
Yeah, good. This is back to your question about, what's reason and where's the role of reason and all the normal stuff. So the book is structured in terms of a quest, and like any good story, you have a beginning, a middle, and an end, right? So those are the three questions that I think drive much of human nature. The question of where did I come from? That's the beginnings. Where am I headed? That's the end, right? And then how do I get there? That's the idea of quest. And so I began looking at some of the origin debates, the origin of the universe, the origin of life, the origin of species, the origin of humans. And that was kind of going from the evidence to what best explains the evidence. So the arrow was from these empirical facts to the explanation for those empirical facts. By the time I get to the meaning chapter, I've kind of switched it. Now we're looking at the interior of the human heart. And we're looking at certain features of the human experience and the longings that we have. And then we're going the other way and we're saying, well, what's the best fit of all those competing stories with the interior of the human heart, right? And so it's actually going the other way. Now we're going from desires to story. Which story best captures these desires? And so the way that I kind of framed it in the book is that we have these at least 6 deep longings of the heart. I call it the existential set. I mean, there's many, many, many more, but at least we all long for purpose, for value, for significance, for intelligibility, for identity, and for transcendence. And so what I did in that chapter is say, okay, these are the deep longings of the heart. What are the stories on offer that help us make sense of our world? And do those stories fit the longings of the heart? And so I looked at 2 versions of nihilism. Nihilism is just the view that there is no meaning of life, no meaning of life. You might find, well, no, there's no meaning whatsoever. So we have absurdism and nice nihilism. Those are two views that I considered. And then I looked at this other view that's really provocative called enchanted naturalism, which is by Owen Flanagan, who's a Duke University philosopher. And he thinks that there is meaning in the world. And actually, he wrote this wonderful book. It's called The Really Hard Problem. And he's riffing on David Chalmers, who's a philosopher of mind, who says that consciousness is the really hard problem, especially given materialism or physicalism. And Owen Flanagan says, no. The really hard problem is meaning in a materialistic world. And so he kind of walks through this idea that, there's meaning in life, even if there's no ultimate meaning to life. And that's good enough, right? And so that's a kind of enchanted naturalism, trying to locate or find some meaning within what I would call the subjective landscape. And then I looked at one final sort of big picture view, what I called enchanted supernaturalism, of which theism, of course, would be one version of that. And just argue that this is actually the story, the view of the world that gives us all those deep longings that fits like lock and key, as Lewis would say,
Right.
Or as Pascal says, it's void, God-shaped void, and God or something like that. So yeah, just considered all those things because I think we long for all these deep things, including meaning. And so I thought that it would be important to kind of engage that in this chapter.
It seems like a lot of people who've endorsed the book have said, this is a great book to give to unbelievers. This is, maybe college students, for instance. And I thought, well, everyone's gone through that point in their life, like, who am I? Why am I here? And this helps to explore those questions in a serious and sort of story journey theme, really good.
You mentioned there the origin of life, and you elaborate on that in the book and say that it suggests that theism is true, one of the clues, if you will. So I kind of have a 2-pronged question for you. First of all, cosmologist Sean Carroll, who you quote in the book, he asserts that, roughly quoting him here, there's no reason to think scientists won't figure out how life started. It is simply a matter of solving puzzles with the known laws of nature. So my questions are, why do you think he's wrong? And then also, why do you think the origin of life, is kind of a signpost or clue for theism?
Yeah, good. Yeah, really interesting reading some of the literature on origin of life. And
I can imagine.
I was struck actually with the confidence. So you have like two dueling narratives, right, on the origin of life, as you can expect, right? You have those like Sean Carroll, and he's not the only one at all, who are confident that we will discover it. It's just a puzzle to be solved, that we will discover the naturalistic origin of life. And then on the other hand, you have others like James Tour, who's one of the leading synthetic chemists, right? Who basically says, hogwash, right? There's like, you're all lying. There's no way that we're going to solve this problem, right? It's just too complex and things like that.
Not to interrupt, but James Tour is hilarious to listen to when he's talking about the origin of life. He just thinks we are nowhere near finding out. Sorry about that. He's so funny when he talks about that.
Yeah. And so I kind of put those two in dialogue and then asked the question, what do the rest of us do, right? If these like high level scientists are both on, the pretty far sides on this issue, what does that mean for us? And then I just put the philosopher cap on and said, well, let's examine the evidence as best we can, right? With epistemic humility, but also with courage, and see where it leads us. And what I found is that I guess I'm persuaded that there's significant problems to the naturalistic origin of life story. How do we make that jump from chemistry to biology? That's a significant barrier, that needs to be jumped. And I examined the evidence, right? And so those, I'm sure your readers or your listeners are probably familiar with some of the early origin of life research that was done in the 1950s with Urey and Miller, and where they tried to kind of formulate like the early Earth, and they were successful, at least initially, in generating a few of the sort of subparts of various macromolecules of life, and that kind of set this trajectory of optimism. But since then, things haven't gone so well. And so you have all these problems, right? You have this ingredients problem. We're just not able to get the basic building blocks of life from any naturalistic path, right? And then we have like this assembly problem. Even if we have all the right ingredients, how do we put them together, right? The cell, which is the most simple life form, as people have noted, is this incredibly complex thing full of information, right? DNA and all these other processes. And there's just no known mechanism for that. And so, I mean, if you put God in the picture, well, then you have a resource, right? You have an intelligence that can explain the jump from chemistry to biology. But apart from that, it's very difficult to see where that leads. So again, what's the most reasonable conclusion given what we know? Well, I think that God is necessary. God is going to be part of an explanation for why we have life on Earth.
So imagine you're in a conversation, and this is, I'm just kind of trying to play devil's advocate to hopefully be helpful. And you're in a conversation and you're sharing what you just did or some form of it. And the person you're talking to says, well, that just seems like, God of the gaps reasoning, because that often comes up in the discussion when somebody tries to suggest that origin of life is a clue, if you will, for theism. How would you kind of tackle that or help them think through that?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. That is a common objection whenever we start talking about science. But I would say this isn't a God of the gaps problem, because we're not postulating deity to explain some mysterious facts that we don't know. We're actually postulating deity as an explanation for life because of all that we've learned about the complexity of the cell, about the early conditions of the Earth, even the timeline is fascinating, right? If you go with the standard timelines, the Earth forms about 4.5 billion years ago on the standard story, right? And then you've got this heavy bombardment period where the Earth is just full of molten lava. There's, of course, no life because it's being bombarded by asteroids. And that takes you to like 3.8 billion years ago. And then you have our earliest fossils are at least 3.5 billion years ago. But some people think we have discovered some of that are 3.7 billion years ago. So if you think about the time frame, even like geologically, between 100 million and 300 million years, this is a very small time for the amount of things that need to conspire, right? Even to get that first cell, the simple cell. And so like just looking at the evidence, it's not based on ignorance, right? It's actually based on what we know about the cell, about the early Earth. Right. And this is why, and the last thing I'll say here, this is why you have leading scientists like Stephen Hawking acknowledging the geological problem and punting to space, right? So he famously suggested maybe life came from outer space, right? Directed transpermia is what he calls it. And again, there's no evidence, and we can look at that as a proposal. And I would argue that it doesn't fit what we know.
Well put. So I also I really appreciated your discussion on the origin and existence of minds. I've always found this fascinating, and typically J.P. Moreland's kind of my go-to guy on that, and I see that you've quoted him there. And I think you rightly point out from a naturalist perspective that matter came before mind, but then a believer in a personal God, or a theist, if you will, would argue that mind came before matter. Can you talk about the significance of this distinction and why you think mind came before matter?
Yeah, good. I mean, you could run this a number of different ways, right? One argument that I find sort of helpful on this with that question, mind before matter, matter before mind, is like, what's a better fit, right? So one way that you could kind of run this argument is like, what fits the evidence that we do see, right? So if the evidence we do see is minds exist, right? That's pretty clear. There's at least three minds talking right now and thinking, at least it seems to be. But there's three minds here. Yeah, I think so, right? So we have this fact, and then what story, right? What worldview, what story of the world, what metaphysic best explains that? And this is why I mentioned a minute ago, David Chalmer, the really hard problem is consciousness. How do you get minds? Right? How do you fit that in a naturalistic world? And so you have all these proposals that people are working on. The most popular one today, the most popular one until recently was some version of what's called non-reductive physicalism, where mental properties are not reducible to physical properties, but they somehow supervene as the word that they use on these physical properties. So it's a physicalism or something near enough. That was kind of like the most popular view. There's been this really interesting shift in philosophy of mind of late. You could think of like Thomas Nagel, who wrote his book in 2012 called Mind and Cosmos, where he says, hey, the naturalistic Darwinian account just can't account for minds. It can't account for consciousness. And so what he does is he takes a half step toward what's called towards the middle, towards something called panpsychism. And so now the leading kind of edge in philosophy of mind, thinking of guys like Philip Goff and a number of others, is defending this view that the only way you get consciousness, or the best way to get consciousness, is if you have consciousness built into the fundamental level of reality. So notice that's actually a half step toward theism in one way, right? Because it will agree with the way that you set up the framework. Mind is prior to matter. But now what the argument is of the panpsychist, or the proto-panpsychist, as they're sometimes called, is that material things are fundamentally conscious things, or if they're not conscious things, they are fundamentally things that can become conscious things. And so what you're doing is building mind back into the fabric of the universe. So in many ways, the debate is sort of shifting that way already because of the difficulty of getting minds from purely materialistic worlds. Theism, of course, is a perfect fit, right? Because on theism, you would not be surprised if God, this conscious being, creates other conscious beings such as ourselves for a whole host of reasons, right? We could talk about reasons why God created, but you wouldn't be surprised on theism, given who God is, that we would have other creatures like him that are conscious in that way. So that's a quick way to do it. In the book, I look at Dan Dennett and his wonderful, I love his title just of his book, From Bacteria to Bach and Back Again, how minds evolved in a naturalistic world, or something like that. Like, you gotta give the guy credit for creativity. And so I interacted a little with him on this question.
Wow. That's fascinating. Yeah. Cause I would think if consciousness was, and I'm not sure I'm going to word this correctly, because this is the first I've heard of that explained the way you just explained it. So correct me if I'm off here, but I would think if consciousness was kind of like programmed, if you will, into the foundation, then that would just push back. Well, then why is that? Right? Is that what you mean by they're taking a step toward theism, or did I misunderstand that?
Yeah, no. So, on the standard story, how it's usually cashed out is fundamental reality is what physics tells us is, whatever the fundamental little bits of matter from physics, that's base reality, right? This is kind of the standard physicalist, naturalistic, materialistic story of the world. So you can appeal to like the standard physics and all the different particles that exist in the fields. What this is, what panpsychism is is it says, no, those aren't the fundamental bits of reality. Or at least we're not understanding them correctly. The fundamental bits of reality have consciousness as part of it just as a brute fact. They're conscious things, or at least they're able to become conscious things. So what you do is you take this problem, the hard problem of consciousness, and it doesn't emerge from a mindless world. It actually emerges, you could say, from a world that already has mind at the beginning. Now that, of course, you're right, begs a question. It doesn't beg a question. That forces the question, what explains that these are the fundamental bits of reality, right? And so even there, I think you would still want to ask the question, what's the best fit? And do we really have evidence that the fundamental BBs, whatever they turn out to be, are conscious or proto-conscious kinds of things? But that's where the debate is, right? And I actually think it's kind of exciting. J.P. Moreland wrote a review of Thomas Nagel's book where he called it slouching toward theism. And in some ways, panpsychism is a slouching toward theism. And it's a useful, I think, step in the dialectic. And now you've got Christian philosophers, Brandon Rickabaugh, one of my colleagues in particular, that I think is quickly becoming sort of a leader in the area of human consciousness and human persons, who I think that this is where some of the work will need to be done, in engaging people like Philip Goff and others with really interesting views that are coming out on this question.
Excellent.
Chad, it reminds me of when we were talking to Perry Marshall, and he mentioned that thing that just caught me off guard. It was about how he was saying that there is the option of cells having consciousness their consciousness being at a cellular level and stuff. And,
right.
And I was like, where's this coming from?
I was the same way.
Yeah. Yep. But would you say, Paul, I don't know if you've heard that aspect of it, Paul, but is that tied to that idea, or is that where that's coming from certain... do certain biologists have that sort of impression?
So the quick answer is I don't know, but it certainly seems consistent with this new movement of panpsychism. If you can have fundamental BBs that either have consciousness or can become conscious, why not fundamental holes at different levels of reality, right? So in some ways, and maybe tell me if this is just too much philosophy, but to switch, so I do metaphysics. That's what I study. And in metaphysics, there's basically like two ways of cashing out concrete material reality. There's what we would call the neo-Humean view, gifted from David Hume, who was an Enlightenment philosopher who famously said something, I'll just kind of riff on it, that all that exists are matter in motion, right? Or atoms in the void, right? Just bumping into each other. That's kind of the neo-Humean mosaic is what it's called. And so you have sophisticated defenses of the neo-Humean mosaic by guys like David Lewis and many others. And that's kind of the dominant view in the academy. What's interesting, though, is there's this other view. This is the view that I would endorse and find myself attracted to. It's, for lack of a better word, it's the neo-Aristotelian view of the world. And on the neo-Aristotelian view, descending largely or broadly from Aristotle, you have fundamental wholes, what are called substances, at multiple levels of reality, right? So you don't just have base level at the level of physics. The microparts are the fundamental stuff, and everything else is derivative, right? That's on the neo-Humean view. On the neo-Aristotelian view, and this is the view I endorse, you have fundamental wholes all over reality, right? Medium-sized substances like you and me that are wholes that have genuine causal powers and genuine consciousness. So in one way, this could just be part of that. I think panpsychism pushes away from the neo-Humean view toward the neo-Aristotelian view. So it could be, I don't know, because I'm not familiar with the exact thing that you're talking about, but it could be part of this sort of wider movement that's taking place where there's kind of, people talk about the revenge of Aristotle that's taking place in biology and in philosophy of science more generally. And so it could be very much a part of that. But again, I don't know for sure, but that's something cool that's happening right now.
Really fascinating.
Yeah,
I could delve into that and listen to more of that. But do we want to move on to another topic, Chad?
Well, yeah, I was going to ask about morality, but Brian, you could learn more about that at Palm Beach Atlantic. I'm just saying.
That's right. That's right. We talk about it all the time.
Are enrolling now. See Paul after class.
That's right. We talk about substances and hylomorphism and all these things all the time, especially in metaphysics. Yeah.
Paul, one of the things I really loved about your book before we kind of, and this will launch us into the next kind of clue that I want to talk about, is how you engage with people like Sean Carroll, Dan Dennett, Eric Wielenberg, and Paul Draper, because one of my, I guess, light criticisms has been that it seems like we've really been hung up on the new atheists for like too long. And I feel like that's kind of passe. And this book was so gratifying to read because I feel like you're interacting with the best of the best. And so I just really appreciated that from the, the atheistic or agnostic side, if you will. And so that was one thing I really appreciated. But you have a thoughtful chapter on morality in which you argue that the existence of objective moral facts is better explained by the existence of a good God. And one of the interesting kind of shifts that has happened that I've seen even since I've been reading philosophy and apologetics is that a lot of atheists used to kind of grant that morality was not objective. But a lot of them now, particularly I'm thinking of someone like Wielenberg, are actually trying to account for objective moral facts. In other words, they acknowledge them, but they try to account for them apart from God. So if I understand him correctly, he argues that moral facts are simply abstract objects or brute facts. It's almost like a moral Platonism, if you will. And you, in your book, you call it brute fact atheism. And I was just curious, can you talk a little bit about why you think that fails to account for the objective moral facts that we experience? Sorry, I know that was a bit wordy, but
No, that's great. Yeah, I mean, so if I were not a theist, I think brute fact atheism is the best option when it comes to morality, right? So I think to me that the live candidates on morality are God. I mean, I canvass God, the universe, and nothing, right? But I think nothing, which is Eric Wielenberg. What explains the objective moral landscape? Nothing does. It's just a brute fact. That's to me as good an explanation. Well, it's not an explanation. It's as good an account as any in some ways for these mysterious things, moral facts. But I do think, as it turns out, that theism is superior for explaining, because we do have an explanation, right? And so in the book, I canvass 4 problems with brute fact atheism, even though I think it's the best atheist option, in my view, if there is no God. And those 4 things real quick, and I'll tell you the one that is most persuasive to me. The 4 things are, it's just number 1, utterly mysterious how properties in the abstract realm hook up with things and actions in this world, right? Why does goodness hook up to the action of walking grandma across the street, but not, but not the act of hitting somebody for no reason? What is badness attached to that? That's just kind of utterly mysterious, right? So that's a deficiency. A second deficiency is that brute fact atheism can't explain the authority or the obligatoriness of moral duties. And to me, this is the strongest reason against the view, right? If you would say, if you think about it just intuitively, we don't owe obligations to abstract objects, right? I'm not morally obligated to the abstract object of being just to act justly, right? But I am obligated to persons, right? I'm obligated to not steal from you and not to lie to my students and things like that, right? But on theism, we have a person at the heart of reality, right? The theistic God. And so that one I think is pretty strong. Number 3, on brute fact atheism, you can't account for the guilt that we often feel in the face of when we do wrong, right? That's a very natural human response. The problem of guilt is a question that we want to give an account for. And then lastly, we cannot account for why moral capacities track moral truths. That just, again, so what happens is you start multiplying brute facts, right? For every action and for every objective value that has a moral fact attached to it, there is no explanation. And when you're assessing mature theories, you want to have as little brute facts as possible, right? We all have things that we take as primitives, but it's just a bloated ideology of brute facts, and that's something that counts against the mature theory. So anyway, I think it's the best thing, but I think theism does way better in explaining why we have objective morality.
Yeah, I thought that was really helpful. Did you get to see Dr. Craig's debate with Dr. Wielenberg by any chance?
I did not, but I read the book that is based on the debate. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I thought that was a great discussion, I thought.
Well, I want to move on to a subject that makes me happy. And so maybe we can look at this idea of happiness. There's a lot of different aspects to it, but how do we use happiness as a signpost towards Christianity? Do we just say, well, if you want to have a happy life, you need to give your life to Jesus? Or are there deeper things, philosophically? I mean, question of the ages, what really makes us happy? How do you approach that subject in the book?
Yeah, so I actually think this is really important to talk about happiness for two reasons. Number one, everyone wants to be happy, right? What is it that you want? I just want to be happy, right? This is the near universal claim of humans. And number two, so there's one fact. Number two is that many of us aren't happy. It remains elusive, right? And so I think that this is an example of a natural sign that needs interpreting. Why do we long for happiness? And I love, like Aristotle said, that we must begin by asking the right preliminary questions. And one preliminary question in this, which I do with every feature in these 11 features, is ask, what is it? What is happiness, right? And so I canvass some counterfeit views that actually what I'm doing in this chapter is in a couple chapters in the book, I have these like guides. I'm trying to engage the imagination. So we have Lady Philosophy, who was consoling Boethius, who was in a jail, condemned to death. And Boethius had kind of lost his way. Now, of course, Boethius is writing, so he's really not talking to Lady Philosophy. He's using her as a foil in his own discussion to explore the nature of happiness. And so I'm basically entering into that discussion with Boethius over the nature of happiness itself, right? Because we all long for it and it remains elusive. And as it turns out, the counterfeits that Boethius considered are the same counterfeits that many people think happiness amounts to today, right? Wealth, success, fame, or pleasure. These are the big four. And so we looked at each of those and argued that none of these are actually what amounts to happiness. And Boethius leads us to this view that basically happiness amounts to union with God, right? And I think that that's right. And so guiding the reader toward the true nature of happiness, that's what we're doing, I think, is helpful guides, right? That's part of the story thing. Here's something that we all long for. How do we get there? How do we find genuine happiness? And as it turns out on the Christian story, man's highest good isn't a material thing. It's not a pleasure thing. It's a relational thing, right? It's union with God. That's our highest good. And as it turns out, if Augustine's right, it's also our deepest longing of the heart, right? He says, our hearts are restless until they find rest in you. And so I kind of unpack, take the reader on a journey and then unpack a little bit more detail what I think on the Christian story happiness amounts to.
Is that a theme that we can use in evangelism? Because as I kind of jokingly alluded to when I introduced the question, Jesus will make you happy, this sort of a thing. But that's the wrong approach. But at the same time, in giving people the bad news and giving them the good news, you are showing them the true way to happiness. So, I mean, would you have any thoughts on how we incorporate that without just being like a fake sell or, totally. Jesus will make you wealthy kind of a thing?
That's what I was thinking. Right.
No, that's good. Actually, I'm glad you pushed back a little bit because this is important. Part of the problem is that we have such a shallow view of happiness in our culture that the question that it seems like such an odd question to ask, what is it that you want? Happiness. Because most people think in Nietzschean terms, right? That happiness amounts to some sort of maximization of unfettered desires, or satisfaction of unfettered desires, or pleasure, or something like that. That's a very shallow view, and it's a very ahistorical view of happiness. Classically, happiness has always been this thicker concept, flourishing in light of our nature, right? This is what the Greeks viewed happiness as. And their answer was that the happy person is the intellectually and morally virtuous person, right? So they're part of this virtue tradition. And the Hebrews actually were not much different, right? They use a slightly different term. If the Greek word is eudaimonia, that's the rich word for happiness in the Greek world. For the Hebrews, it was shalom. And it's this idea that we flourish in light of our nature. So Jesus is ultimately part of that answer, right? But I actually don't go there. I think, I do at the end of the day, but because as it turns out, happiness is 4 relational goods. So here they are. Rightly related to God, right? rightly related to ourself. That's the character, that's the integrity, that's the intellectual and moral virtue. Rightly related to others, including nature, and then rightly related to our end, our telos, our purpose. Yeah, so as it turns out, you could give this like, Jesus is the answer, Sunday school answer. And in the end of the day, that is part of it, right? But it's a much richer answer that includes all these facets of what it means to be human. And so that's why I think the happiness question is important for us to address in apologetics, because it's the thing that we all long for. And there is an answer to this that ultimately points to the Christian story as the place where we find genuine fulfillment and happiness.
I really enjoyed the chapter on pain. I know that sounds odd, but I did because I loved your interaction with Paul Draper's hypothesis of indifference. And I thought it was very well done, very well thought out. Can you kind of explain for our listeners' benefit what Draper's argument entails and then why you think ultimately Christian theism specific defeats it, which I also like that move that you made too of kind of like, okay, we're going to go from a generic theism to Christian theism specifically, and that gives us a lot more tools kind of in our tool belt, if you will. But
yeah, okay, I'll try. This is one of the more technical chapters. But Paul Draper, wonderful philosopher. He was at Purdue just at the end while I was finishing up my dissertation there, and had opportunities to interact with him, but really respect him as a thinker. And he wrote, in many ways, he picked up sort of the leading atheist/agnostic philosopher of religion who's arguing that the problem of evil is a problem for theists, right? And a reason to reject theism. And so in his sort of famous article on pleasure and pain, he argues that the distribution of pleasure and pain that we find in the world is more probable on what he calls the hypothesis of indifference, right? This is the idea, the hypothesis of indifference is just in simple terms, the idea that the universe doesn't care about humans, doesn't care about sentient creatures, right? And he kind of contrasts that hypothesis with theism. And you can think of like a mere theism, that there's a God who has all the omni properties of all good, all powerful, and all knowing. And he argues that given the distribution of biological pain and biological pleasure, he thinks that, and the non-useful stuff, like there's a lot of gratuitous pain and pleasure, it seems to be. And so he thinks that the best explanation is that the universe doesn't care, right? There is no God. He thinks that's an argument against theism. And part of the discussion there was actually arguing, hey, even if it is the best explanation, if we just have two competing hypotheses, the hypothesis of indifference and theism, Christian theism and Jewish theism and Muslim theism are more fine-grained versions of theism that add auxiliary hypotheses that make the existence of evil and suffering more probable. And so, and basically I just looked at on the Christian story, you would expect, because of the nature of humans and the nature of sin, given the doctrine of original sin, you would expect the kinds of pleasures and pains that we find in the world. And so anyway, just walk through that because I take Paul Draper to be a serious objector, that if we're going to discover the true story of the world, we've got to engage the question of evil and suffering. And to me, there's no one better doing that from the atheist side today than Paul Draper. So I wanted to engage his arguments a little bit.
Yeah. And I that's a good summary. And I do recommend that. The book alone is excellent, but even just for that chapter, it's worth having. So one belief that I just see that persists, regardless of how many times it is demonstrated to be false, is this idea that all religions are basically true, or that they all teach essentially the same, truths. However, in A Good and True Story, your book, you argue that there can only be one true religion. And I agree with you, but I'd like you to just share how you conclude that.
You're right. That is such a pervasive view out there. All religions lead to God, and it doesn't really matter what your doctrines are. Yeah, and it doesn't go away. And so, of course, in a book, when I'm looking at 11 clues, I do think the last clue was religion itself, right? The fact that through history, as well as today, the majority of the world are religious, right? Even the Latin word religiare is to bind, right? This trying to bind the sacred and the profane, right? The mundane and the transcendent realms together. That's what religion does. And so I thought that it would be important on a purely logical level to realize that at the meta level, there can only be one true religion, right? Because they all contradict each other, right? So given the law of non-contradiction, they can't all be right. If one religion, to boil it down, simply says Jesus is God, and another one says Jesus is not God, one of those is true and one of those is false, right? And so it can't be that both Christianity and Islam or Judaism are true, because they have different views on Jesus and they have different views on the afterlife, and on and on and on. And so that was just a point that's purely logical. And usually I like to throw that out there sometimes because it's become such a emotional thing. You know, you mean to tell me that my good Buddhist friend is going to hell or something like that? And no, I don't mean to tell you that. I just want to begin with the purely logical claim, right? That truth is exclusive, and anything that contradicts a true statement is false. And so I think we begin there. And then what that does is it shifts the dialectic toward the evidence. Okay, if they can't all be true, right? And we're truth seekers, we want to be reason responsive. We're seeking the true story of the world. Which one has the most evidence? And in this chapter, I just briefly, this is actually the most personal, this is the last chapter and the most personal chapter, where I share my own journey, actually, as a freshman at college, my undergrad institution, where two guys knocked on my door and they said they were religious. And I said, cool, I'm religious too. At least I thought I was, but I wasn't. And they shared the gospel, basically, and they just freaked me out. I'm like, what? Is this true? If this is true, I've totally missed the boat. And so, but what it did is it sent me on a journey. I actually took my freshman year and tried to refute the resurrection. I went to an apologetics class. I didn't know that's not normal, but I went to one with a Christian that was in my dorm, so took me to this class. And every week they would show me the evidence, and they would ask at the end of the class, "What do you think of the evidence?" And I would say it's quite strong. And they would push back. At some point, you need to make a decision. And I would say, "Yeah, you're right." You know, and that went on and on for a year. But what I loved about it was I realized that's where the evidence is, where this decision lies. Where does the evidence point? Not some claim about all religions, even though they contradict each other, being true, right? That can't be right. And now as a philosopher, I know why, because of the law of non-contradiction, right? They can't all be true. Yes. So that's what I'm doing. And that's why it's important to start there in that chapter.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, Paul, it's been a great discussion, and thank you for your book, which is unique amongst apologetics books. It's doing apologetics, and it's a great gift for those who are listening. If you have skeptical people in your life who are still open but willing to explore the issues, this might be one to consider. Definitely runs the gamut of different experiences, everything from scientific to the aesthetic and the things that are at the core of our being and the story we're in. Paul, where can people find more of your resources? And is there anything else you'd like to point our listeners to as we depart?
Yeah, no, that's great. You can find me online. I've got a website that I house some of these things, paul-gould.com. You can also find, I've got a podcast that I do called the Udo Podcast. You can find that on the normal places that you find podcasts, as well as the twotasksinstitute.org. But I would just point people, if you're interested in exploring these things, check out what we're doing at Palm Beach Atlantic in philosophy and also in apologetics as well. Yeah, but I'm pretty easy to find online. So, and I'll just say, we didn't talk about my two favorite chapters, actually, which are the chapters on love and beauty. So maybe we'll have to have a chat about that some other time. So those are fun ones.
Those are standalone topics. We could actually do that. All right. Well, thanks for joining us, Paul. Much appreciated.
Yes, thank you.
It's great to be with you guys. Blessings to you both.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If you have a question you'd like us to address or just a message for us, feedback, good or bad, you can either email us at podcast@apologetics315.com or leave a voice message for us using SpeakPipe. Just go to speakpipe.com/apologetics315 to leave us a message. And remember, if you include a Ghostbusters quote in your question, we guarantee that we'll read it on the podcast. We also ensure up to 50% better quality answers. Also, if you've enjoyed today's podcast, please leave a review in iTunes or the podcast platform of your choice. And please share this episode with a friend if you found it useful. Remember, you can find lots of apologetics resources at apologetics315.com, along with show notes for today's episode. Find Chad's apologetic stuff over at Truthbomb Apologetics. That's truthbomb.blogspot.com. This has been Brian Auten and Chad Gross for the Apologetics 315 podcast, and thanks for listening.